Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, hello to all. This week we have the sustainability team at Sustain.Life bringing to you another live discussion on what's going on, thoughts we're having, conversations behind the hood, behind the curtain of our team. I am Alyssa Ray, Chief Sustainability Officer of Sustain.Life, and I am joined here by two colleagues of mine who I will let them introduce themselves. Constance, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Hi, I'm Constance Duke. I'm the Director of Sustainability at Sustain.Life, and I lead our technical practice.
And I'm Nick Lusanteg. I'm a Senior Manager for Sustainability on our technical sustainability practice.
Awesome. So now that everyone knows who we are, let's tell them what we want to talk about today, which is science-based targets and targets. So I think maybe let's set the stage a little bit. We've been talking about this internally at our group, but what is a science-based target? What is the science-based target initiative? What is an arbitrary target? What are the different values and impacts of these things? Let's set the stage a little bit with some context on what we mean when we're talking about these different kinds of targets that a company can set. All right, so who wants to start? What's an SBT?
I'll jump in. So an SBT is basically a climate target that's informed by climate science. If you're setting a target that's not an SBT or where you're not directly looking at climate science, then it's a little bit like flying blind. You don't exactly know, do we need to reduce by 10% in 3 years or 30% in 10 years, et cetera. So science-based targets are basically targets that are aligned with some sort of warming scenario that is published by the IPCC and IEMA to limit warming below a certain amount. And the way they do that is they figure out, okay, here's how much carbon we can emit, and here's the point at which we need to be net zero. And then working from there, you can figure out as an organization, how much do we need to reduce? How quickly do we need to reduce? And when do we need to be at net zero?
All right, so I have to ask the question. Obviously, that sounds like an incredible goal. What company wouldn't want to set a science-based target and want to align with the warming scenarios and do their part to make sure we all get there at a globe? But what can we say, and what about the companies who ask and say, I'm just getting started. I'm really not ready to bite off that much. That seems like a lot. Of course, that's what I want philosophically, but either, I need to start this from the ground up of my business, I need CEO buy-in, or just I'm trying to get my feet wet and get started, but I don't think I'm quite ready to really wrap my arms around that. What are some steps that they can take? What are some other options, if you're not ready for a science-based target?
There obviously still are a lot of companies that set arbitrary targets because that's what they're comfortable with, right? It's easy to say, maybe if we reduce our emissions by 3% over X number of years, that's something we're comfortable with. But it doesn't really align the effort with budgets and, certain initiatives that are actually targeting decarbonization. So I think a lot of companies still are in that position. And I think it's okay to say we're not ready to set an SBT because we just haven't thought through our strategy enough at this point. And in the interim, I would even say it's okay to set a very short-term target just to demonstrate that you're doing something. So if you can be transparent and say, we're not ready for a science-based target, but we are aiming to reduce our emissions by 5% by next year over our baseline year, just to give us more time to figure out this whole science-based targets thing. And I think that's better than to set an arbitrary target out to, 2030 or something that really should be a science-based target.
Interesting.
Yeah, you can also set a different type of science-based target, one that's not going to be so aggressive as a starting point. The organization that we'll discuss in a little bit, SBTi, they've aligned themselves with the warming scenario of 1.5 degrees C, which is basically, most likely warming will have the global have warmed by 1.5 degrees by the year 2100. But you could say, you know what? We're not ready for that. That's too aggressive for us right now, but we want to do something and we still want it to be grounded in some science. So we're going to go with the well below 2C scenario, which which is going to be slightly less aggressive, or maybe we're going to limit this to only a certain subgroup of our emissions.
Interesting, interesting. Okay, so now we're talking about SBTs, science-based targets. What happens when we stick an I at the back of that acronym there? What's SBTi? Because, I think our listeners may have heard about that and may conflate an SBT with an SBTi, which fair, they're close enough, but can we shed some light on that for them?
Yeah, so SBTi is the Science Based Targets Initiative, and they are currently, I think, the only body that is verifying science-based targets for companies, and over 500 companies have done this. They evolved out of a different science-based targets approach between the World Wildlife Fund at the time and CDP, and then it just kind of grew from there, and they ended up with the science-based target method, or publishing science-based target methods. And I guess it's worth saying that the SBTi hasn't come up with all the methodologies for setting science-based targets. They are also referring to something called economic intensity targets that come from different organizations and their different methods. So, for instance, British Telecom came up with one of those methods. The Center for Sustainable Organizations came up with another method. So they kind of have aggregated all the different methods out there for science-based target setting.
Interesting, interesting. And do we know when they came on the scene, how long they've been around?
Good question.
Yeah.
I can tell you how long science-based targets have been around, and that's since 2006, and that actually was the Center for Sustainable Organizations with their context-based targets. And then I know in 2009, Autodesk actually created a really cool science-based target settings tool, and I only know this because I used them in my thesis to compare the targets that California companies had set against what they should have set using a science-based target. And it was really interesting because only 14% of the companies that had set targets had set science-based targets at the time, and were on track to achieve them. Another 14% had set science-based targets and were not on track to achieve them. At least, this was I think the data I looked at was 2013, 2014. So companies were definitely already doing it several years ago and found it challenging then too.
And what about today? Do we know the percentage of companies that are setting targets? How many of those are science-based targets versus arbitrary targets? Is that something that varies by industry or company size or public-private?
We have that some of that information from the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP. Don't know the numbers off the top of my head. They do have a list on their website. One thing that's interesting is, in the fall, SBTi published their criteria for net zero targets. So previously they were just doing near-term targets that were like 10 to 15 years. And now they've published their net zero targets. And a lot of the big companies, especially the companies that we associate with good sustainability programs, have come out and committed to saying they are going to set a net zero target through SBTi, which is a big deal because it's a pretty aggressive framework.
Okay, so what does a net zero target entail? What's so aggressive about it? Does that mean that a company has to get to zero, as the name might suggest, does it mean they have to get to zero emissions by a certain timeline or by aligning with a certain warming scenario?
Yeah, aligning on a certain timeline by 2050, no later than that. So companies out there may say they have a net zero goal by 2060, and both according to SBTi and the climate science, although it sounds lofty, you're not gonna hit net zero in time for it to make enough of a difference. What makes it really aggressive, though, is less the timeline and more about the scope. You're required to include the majority of your scope 3 emissions, which is generally the biggest part of your inventory. And then the other thing that makes it aggressive is you're prohibited from doing things that often make net zero a lot easier, namely purchasing offsets. So it is a net zero standard, which means that you can have some carbon removals as a part of your achieving your goal. But offsets in the way we know them now would not count towards SBTi's net zero standard, which is a big deal because we see a lot of companies these days publishing net zero targets or talking about offsets and how they're going to use them to reach their net zero targets, and those would not comply with SBTi. And I think that that's the responsible way for it to be framed.
Yeah, and SBTi really clearly distinguishes between nature-based solutions, which is what we know as offsets from, forestry and things like that, and then technological carbon removals, which are allowed. So it's just that technology isn't quite where it needs to be.
Interesting. And yeah, I think that one of the questions that our listeners might have is what's the difference between an offset, which you hear all over the news, all over, sustainability reports, all over environmental claims, and carbon removal? Because if SBTi has a clear distinction of those two, can help explain that for our listeners.
Yeah, well, they're both carbon removals, right? It's just that one is a permanent removal. So if you have, carbon capture technology and you can permanently remove carbon from the air, that's kind of a safe bet. If you are removing carbon by planting trees, but due to climate change, we're also seeing increased wildfires, then your carbon offsets will just kind of burn to the ground. The trees could be cut down. There is a lot that could interfere with the permanence of nature-based carbon offsetting solutions.
Yeah, I would think of the difference as, one is a literal removal of carbon and the other one is a theoretical removal of carbon. So with the technological approach, you literally have a ton of carbon that you're removing and injecting underground or doing something with. Whereas with nature-based offsets, it's all calculated through mathematics, how much you think would have been saved.
Interesting. That's actually an incredibly clarifying point to think about the difference of the physical, actual, tangible removal versus kind of more of a projected theoretical math equation where you think it will probably get removed, but I think we'll save the criticism and the discussion on offsets for another time because we don't have enough time to get into that today. But I think that's a really helpful distinction for everyone to understand. Okay, cool. Well, not to jerk our heads too much, but I think we just have to pivot for a moment and spend a little bit of airtime talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, and some coverage that it received recently from the Times, and something that is a pretty big deal about it that people may not realize is such a big deal, and that is that through that law, greenhouse gases were officially legally classified as pollutants, which may not be so intuitive to folks, right? When we think of pollutants, we kind of think of smog and acid rain and dirty air, and not necessarily these invisible insulating molecules that lead to climate change. So Nick, I think you had some thoughts on this. Why is this a big deal, and what does it mean that they are officially classified as pollutants?
Yeah, the Inflation Reduction Act is just a gift that keeps on giving. There's so much to talk about in there. But yeah, earlier this week, New York Times reported that there is a line in there defining GHGs as pollutants, and this is a very intentional definition included by Democrats, and it harkens back to the Supreme Court case that was ruled on earlier this summer, West Virginia v. EPA, where West Virginia was challenging the Clean Power Plan, which was an Obama-era plan for the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. And West Virginia cares a lot about that because they burn a lot of coal, a very carbon intensive fuel. And basically the Supreme Court's ruling was that the EPA can't regulate greenhouse gases because they're not explicitly given the power to do so through the Clean Air Act, which was, written a long time ago before climate change was a major part of the political discussion. That Supreme Court decision actually has, wide-ranging impacts on issues other than just the environment and climate change. But in this specific case, Democrats were sort of like, okay, we'll play your game then. We'll define greenhouse gases as a pollutant, and now it's it's in the legislation, and now the EPA can go back and re-implement the Clean Power Plan or some version of it.
Wow. So basically, because this previous Supreme Court ruling said EPA, you can regulate and oversee pollutants. That's your purview. That's your right under what's granted to you in the Clean Air Act. But you can't regulate greenhouse gases. That's not what that law was written for. By this law, the IRA now classifying the greenhouse gases as pollutants, that automatically means that now EPA does have purview. They do have the rights and oversight of those.
Yeah, it's just a simple semantic change almost that gives them that right. I don't even think the act specifically calls out the EPA in regulating them. It just says, "Yep, by the way, GHGs, they're a pollutant."
And that makes it so much easier for the EPA, because to get around this SCOTUS decision, they would have had to come up with some kind of an alternative, like really tying climate change to public health in order to continue to regulate it against this court ruling. So this is definitely a gift to the EPA.
That's incredible. I feel like it's so often in the news or frankly on podcasts, you hear about the slow chipping away of rights or oversight through this kind of exact tactic of verbiage and semantics, and how one thing interprets it and classifies it, and so then how that was carried by, through and another thing that was slightly related but not so immediately clear. And it's kind of incredible to see, Nick, in your words, but that a little bit the Democrats catching on to that tactic, catching on to that game, and seeing it work, in your favor, or in this scenario in the world's favor.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate. It's a game that they have to play, but those are the rules that have been established right now.
Right. Cool. All right. Well, I think that brings this session of Coffee Talk to a wrap. Thanks, Constance and Nick, for sharing your insight here. And we will see our listeners next time.
All right. Thanks, Alyssa.
Right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.